Right, well, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us for this webinar, which is launching, as you will all know, I hope, the latest research, the latest report from Gingerbread on the impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on single parents. This is work that's been funded by Standard Life Foundation, where we at the Institute for Employment Studies have been working with Gingerbread on assessing and understanding the impacts on the crisis on single parents. This has been a long-running project, and today we're publishing the final report. Gingerbread are publishing the final report, looking at single parents' journeys through the COVID-19 pandemic, and in particular looking at findings through the latter parts of the crisis. The first report was published back in November, so you'll find that with just a quick Google, and looked at the impacts in particular of the first lockdown, where we found really significant, as one would expect, significant negative impacts on single parents from the shutdown. And now we're looking at then what's happened through the summer and through the latter part of the year. I have a couple of housekeeping things that I need to get out of the way first. So the first, I should have introduced myself. So I'm Tony Wilson, and I'm the director at the Institute for Employment Studies. Now, the housekeeping points, first is to say that this session is being recorded, and it will be available to view after the launch event. The second is to say that hopefully people would have used Zoom before. If not, it's really easy. But there's a Q&A box at the bottom of your screens. So if you have any questions at all through the presentations, then please do write them in. And once the presentations are finished, we'll come back and we'll do some Q&A from there. We've had a couple of questions submitted in advance. We'll probably start with those. So thank you to people who've taken the time to submit questions already. Now, we might not get through all the questions, but we'll see how we go. I think that was all I wanted to say. So look, I'm going to hand over in just a moment to our first speaker. We'll be hearing from Victoria Benson, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Gingerbread. We'll then hear from Laura Dewar and Liz Cleary, who've been leading the work, who are the policy and research leads at Gingerbread and leading the project. And then we'll also be hearing from Andrea, who is a single parent, who'll be telling us about her experiences over the last year. So thank you again for joining us. I think it's going to be a really useful both of our session. Really keen to hear from the speakers and to hear from all of you with your feedbacks and thoughts too. So we'll begin by handing over to Victoria. Victoria, over to you.
Firstly, I wanted to thank you, Tony, for chairing the event today and for the excellent quantitative work that your organisation provided for this report. I also want to thank Liz and Laura for all of their hard work in pulling together this excellent report. As Tony said, I'm Victoria Benson, Chief Exec of Gingerbread. I'm also a single parent, and I can relate to many of the experiences you're going to hear about this morning and that are described in more detail in the report. As a single parent of school-aged children who worked full-time throughout the pandemic and juggled both work and home education, I can safely say that this was one of the toughest times I've ever experienced, and I'm one of the lucky ones. I had a job and a sympathetic employer. I know many single parents had it much harder. Of course, the pandemic and the lockdowns have been tough on everyone, but it has been even harder for the UK's 1.8 million single parents. Throughout the pandemic, Gingerbread has provided practical support to many of those single parents through our advice and information line, our website, and our expanded network of Gingerbread groups. And we saw a massive increase in demand for our services, with the helpline, for example, seeing a huge 130% increase in calls. We saw single parents affected by money, for example, loss of hours, jobs, income, loss of child maintenance, all accompanied by an increase in costs due to their children being home full-time, closure of schools and childcare providers. And many single parents were working in the lockdown sectors, so in many cases they lost their jobs or hours or were simply unable to work from home. A disproportionate number of single parents have been furloughed, and their future remains uncertain when the furlough scheme comes to an end. Mental health issues arising from anxiety, isolation, loneliness, exhaustion, and the sheer relentlessness of it all have unsurprisingly increased during the past 15 months or so. Single parents have been largely forgotten by policymakers and employers during the last year and have been left to fend for themselves. As well as providing support, we believe that it is just as important to represent the experiences of single parents through the pandemic in our research and influencing work. Single parents are still hugely disadvantaged, and it's important that we continue to highlight their experience and campaign for change. Today's research focuses on single parents who were working and caring at the start of the pandemic. Before the pandemic, single parents already faced disadvantage in trying to combine working and caring. Today's research report shines a light on the enormous additional pressures faced by single parents over the last year. The quantitative analysis conducted by our research partners, the Institute for Employment Studies, shows the effect of the pandemic on single parents' working lives. The qualitative interviews with single parents illustrate the strain and upheaval that many of them faced in trying to juggle working and caring. For some, this meant losing their job and trying to navigate the scarce flexible jobs on offer and the restrictions to childcare. For others, it meant being furloughed and facing potential job insecurity further down the line. For most of the parents who were interviewed, it meant a huge pressure in trying to keep their job while caring and homeschooling their children on their own. It is no surprise to see the mental health strains experienced by single parents and their children during the pandemic. I'm really grateful that Andrea, one of the single parents who was interviewed for the project, is going to speak about her experience later on. I'd also like to thank Standard Life Foundation, who have provided support and insight throughout the project. And finally, if the government are serious about building back better for all, then they need to make sure that single parent families, 1 in 5 families of all families with children, are not left behind. This report sets out clear recommendations for most government and businesses, including where there are gaps in policy that prevent single parents being financially secure. Statements of intent from politicians are all very well, but what we need is practical, concrete policy change matched with financial commitments and law changes, and that's needed now before single parents and their children sink further down financially and are left well and truly behind. Thank you. I'm now going to pass you over to Liz Cleary and Laura Dewar, who are going to talk through the report findings.
Thank you very much, Victoria. Oops, go back to the beginning. Do too many spoilers. I'll go back to the beginning. Apologies.
Okay.
Liz?
Hi everyone. My name is Elizabeth Cleary, and today, along with Laura Dewar from Gingerbread and Andrea, one of our research participants, we're going to talk through some of the main findings from our Caring Without Sharing project. So just to explain briefly the background to the project. At the start of the pandemic, we became very aware that the specific needs of single parents weren't being accounted for in policy development. Which is why we decided that work was needed to explore single parents' experiences in more detail. And we took the decision to focus on those single parents who weren't essential workers. And this was because in the first lockdown, critical workers were given access to education and childcare. And we realised that those single parents who didn't have access to these things were likely to face the most challenging circumstances, being required to work and care in isolation. In terms of our methods, this was a mixed methods project. We undertook 2 sets of qualitative interviews. So we interviewed 40 single parents in the summer of 2020, and in the winter of 2021, 33 of those parents agreed to talk to us again. At the same time, the Institute for Employment Studies undertook an analysis of labour force survey data, and that was really to see how the work trajectories of single parents compared or differed to those of other family types. Inevitably, the pandemic has been very fast moving, so we've been very keen throughout to ensure that our findings are fed into relevant policy discussions as they occur. And for that reason, we've been talking to government departments and the House of Lords throughout, making sure they're aware of our findings about single parents' experiences. And it's worth saying as well that the findings that we're going to talk about today will serve as a historic record of single parents' experiences in the pandemic, as well as providing important information to inform future policy development in areas that remain relevant going forward. So I just want to briefly touch on the experiences and situations of single parents before the pandemic, because it's important to bear in mind that even before COVID-19 hit, single parents were in a less financially secure position and on lower incomes than other family types, 2 factors that would inevitably affect their experiences over the next year. So a particularly stark statistic is the fact that mothers in couple households earned almost twice as much per week as single mothers at the start of the pandemic. It's also important to bear in mind that single parents are overrepresented in routine occupations and in particular sectors including distribution, hotels and restaurants. And these were the occupations and sectors that were to become particularly impacted by the pandemic due to the national lockdowns. So I'm now going to hand over to Laura Dewar, who's going to trace single parents working journeys throughout the COVID pandemic.
Thank you so much, Liz. So I'm going to cover three main areas under the work journeys through the pandemic for single parents: working from home, furlough, job security, job losses, and contact with Job Centre Plus. So in terms of working from home, the first lockdown in March 2020 saw an increase in the proportion of single parents working from home, but this was far less pronounced than it was for couple parents, an increase of 21% for single parents compared to an increase of 38% for couple parents. And there's been some decrease across the board in terms of people working from home, but we've still seen a doubling in the number of single parents who are working from home. And with the interviews that Liz and I conducted in the summer, there were really highly polarised views about whether working from home was a positive change. For some parents, they found it very isolating, and for others, they saw the practical positive change, say, for instance, in not having to commute, and some savings, say, in their commuting costs, like their petrol costs. But by early this year, when Liz and I interviewed the parents again, single parents seem much more resigned to working from home as the new normal, and particularly the potential for hybrid working. And as Lindsay, one of the single parents who we interviewed, said, "I really like working from home because obviously there's no commute. I used to pay for breakfast and after school club, and that's a bit of a save now. I'm not having to do that, and I just find it a lot easier from home, to be honest." So as Victoria's alluded to, single parents have particularly high furlough rates compared to coupled parents. And although furlough rates have fallen for all groups, they've remained significantly higher for single parents, even by the end of last year. So even when the economy opened up to some extent in the summer and autumn, single parents were still more likely to be away from their jobs. And in our research, 7 single parents had been furloughed. Indeed, Andrea, who I'm going to talk to later on in the session, was furloughed. So in our research, 7 single parents had been furloughed throughout or at some point in the year, and emphasised ongoing concerns about its financial impact and their long-term job security. So as Karen put it, the firm has managed without me, to be honest, which is then making me very concerned for the security of my job going forward. So this is a chart showing how furlough has declined, but remained more common for single parents. So in terms of job security and job losses, we looked at the labour force survey data, which has actually shown that employment fell marginally for single parents over the first year of the pandemic. Other studies have shown much greater job losses. But single parent unemployment still remains quite high. Single parent unemployment is higher than it is for couple parents at 12%. And we think that the full picture of job losses for single parents really won't be known till the end of the furlough scheme in the autumn. When single parents were interviewed by Liz and I in the summer, the fear of job losses was really widespread. And during the course of the project, 6 parents actually lost their job. And job security did remain a concern for single parents when we interviewed them in early this year. But these had often broadened out, rather than about their individual job, about the economy more generally and what impact that could have across all different sectors. As Shona put it, "I just worry about job security. It's something that started to worry me more. I think being at home, because I'm so used to being out busy traveling, talking to people, I'm worrying that I'm not doing enough. And in terms of looking for work, 3 single parents moved into new employment during the course of the project, which accords with earlier research that Liz and I did at Gingerbread on in-work progression, which showed it's much easier to move into work when time out of the labour market is much more limited. Single parents work something called work conditionality. So if you're on an out of work benefit, then you should be looking for work. This was actually suspended between March and July of last year. But even though work conditionality has returned, single parents spoke in positive terms about their work coaches, who were largely supportive, and the contact that single parents had with job centres was quite minimal. But those who had moved back into work didn't do so through the conventional route of applying for advertised vacancies, and they didn't secure work through their contact with Job Centre Plus or their work coaches. And work coaches were really constrained by the available part-time and flexible jobs that they could alert single parents to. So as Marilyn put it, my work coach went through a point where he was ringing with jobs, and then they would turn out not to be suitable, because although some of the jobs would be part-time, the training would be full-time and not from home. And now I'm going to hand back to Liz to talk about single parents' caring journeys during the pandemic.
Thank you, Laura. So there's 5 key themes I want to touch on here. So school and childcare closures and absences, both due to the national lockdowns and the requirement to self-isolate with positive cases in bubbles. Homeschooling, balancing work and caring, employer flexibility and mental health concerns. So as I reiterated at the start, the single parents we interviewed this project weren't essential workers. So for that reason, the vast majority didn't have access to key worker childcare and education. Though actually we found that during the 3rd lockdown, some schools became more flexible about this and did offer places to single parents, often because they realised they were struggling, though there was a marked inconsistency nationally in relation to this as well. I think what's really important is a view consistently expressed throughout by single parents that they actually should have been given more priority because of the unique challenges facing them having to work in care and isolation. And this view is nicely summarised by Leanne. And Leanne said to us, if there's a single parent who's got kids that they have to homeschool, like more than one kid, I don't know how they can cope and how hold down their own job as well. They need some sort of priority because they must be going crazy. In addition to school closures, obviously there was a challenge of having to self-isolate, initially for 14 days, later for 10 days, if children encountered a positive COVID case in their bubbles at school. And for some of the single parent families we spoke to, particularly those with multiple children, this happened on a multiple number of occasions. And it was quite problematic, particularly in terms of its financial impacts. We noted a widespread lack of awareness of the track and trace isolation grant, which was the policy solution put in place by government in order to mitigate these impacts. But we also found a real conflict in single parents' minds between what was required from them in terms of their work and their caring. And I think this was really nicely summarised by Penny. So Penny was a single parent we interviewed who worked outside of the home and had a son. And when her son was required to isolate due to a positive case in her class, Penny said to us, we have to follow the protocol of isolating. I can go to work apparently, but my son can't go to school, but he can't actually leave the house. So I'm a single parent. You're saying it's okay for me to go to work, but what do I do with my son? It just doesn't make any sense. Inevitably, closures of schools and self-isolation put a requirement upon a large number of single parents to homeschool their children. And here we encountered a wide range of different challenges. These included motivating children, understanding the content of what they were learning and the necessary teaching methods, dealing with access to technology, dealing with requirements for extra meals and so on. One marked thing we noticed is that by the time of the third lockdown, single parents talked about improved provision and communication from schools. There was much more structure, much more interaction with teachers and with peers. And this was generally viewed very positively. However, challenges did remain for those with primary age children in particular, who obviously couldn't just leave them on their own to get on with it. And this position is sort of summarised by Jasmine, who said to us of her daughter, "She cannot just sit at a laptop and I cannot just say, get on with it. I need to be the one that controls the laptop. I have to obviously teach her it as well as we go along. And then I am not a teacher, so I do not know what I am doing." There is some evidence as well of schools being inconsistent in the amount of work required. And from the perspective of single parents, sometimes quite unrealistic, given the context of lockdown and the fact parents were needing to work as well. And this view was summarised by Emma, who told us of her son. "He does maths, English, he does his science, he does his history, but anything like DT or anything, I just do it because otherwise we'd be there all day and I'm working anyway." This brings us nicely on to one of the key challenges which we discussed in this project, the challenge of balancing working and caring, which was particularly experienced during the first and third lockdowns when single parents had their children at home. The single parents we spoke to characterised this challenge as an impossible balancing act. They told us how they had to make compromises to their work and caring, many of which they were uncomfortable with. And while the situation had improved by the third lockdown, for a number of reasons, including the availability of support bubbles, greater access to school places and increased employer flexibility, the two quotes I'm about to read out just showed how in individual circumstances it really was impossible for single parents to recover everything that was required of them. So starting off with Jasmine, who was talking about her daughter. So Jasmine said to us, "Because she is a bit older, she speaks to friends, she knows that she has not done work one day, she will get upset that she is going to get in trouble, and I'm having to try and explain to her, I have got to do my work." Similarly, Emma described the challenge of balancing her own work with homeschooling for her children. So Emma said to us, "It is quite hard. I mean, Monday, Tuesday, it's horrendous because I'm really busy with work and I go to bed very stressed and tearful. But then Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, it eases up a bit for my job, so it gets a bit easier. But it is too much. In fact, I was thinking this week of just doing maths and English and just not doing the rest, quite frankly." Now, one of the key factors which emerged, which really informed single parents' experience in this area and could make things a lot easier, was employer flexibility. This had a really significant impact on single parents' abilities to balance their work and their caring roles. And this was largely around employers allowing them to work hours that fit around their caring responsibilities so that they could cover everything within the hours in the day. As Lindsay told us, "It is really difficult, but my work are really good and they're really flexible. As long as I do my 5 hours a day, at some point do what I need to do, they're pretty good and really flexible." And we were very pleased when we interviewed single parents in the winter to see that this flexibility from employers had really seemed to have increased by the time of the third lockdown and seemed much more universal. But having said that, we did find that some employers were less supportive when single parents were required to self-isolate. And this was often in terms of finances and letting them take leave and so on. So Kelly, for example, said to us, "I was annoyed and upset because work weren't being supportive. They basically said you can have it unpaid or you can continue to work." Alice also discussed the financial impacts having to self-isolate had on her. So Alice said, "So yes, that affected pay as well, that did, because they would only give us statutory sick pay for the week." So finally, everything I've covered so far has translated into really widespread mental health concerns for single parents, both in relation to themselves and in relation to their children. And this was something we encountered when we spoke to them at the end of the first lockdown, but was much more prevalent when we spoke to them in the winter as well. And obviously, for both single parents and children, there's kind of a continuum of concerns. So in terms of single parents, a handful had needed to contact their GPs or were taking medication. And we talked to several who were on sick leave, had left their jobs or reduced their hours due to mental health concerns. But more universally, almost everyone we spoke to reported a sense of fatigue and acknowledged the impacts of multiple lockdowns on their mental health and well-being. And Anna, for example, described her own situation as follows. I do not know if it is just the lockdown or what, but I'm struggling broadly with my mental health, and I did go back on a phased return, but it was making me ill. In terms of reported impacts for single parents' children, many children were reported as missing their friends, their usual activities and their routines. And again, for a smaller number, we heard of more significant concerns, and these were primarily around secondary age children becoming isolated from their friends. I think Karen, who we spoke to, nicely described the situation for children. So Karen told us it's been very, very difficult for the children to be taken out of their routines, away from their friends, and to be essentially prisoners in their own home. And finally, I wanted to show you some labour force survey data, which just exemplifies why mental health is such a big concern for single parents. So the columns in blue show the situation pre-pandemic, and the columns in yellow, the situation during the pandemic. And you can see on the left-hand side that the two sets of figures relating to single parents show both that mental health concerns were much greater for single parents before the pandemic, but also that these have increased markedly throughout. So we're looking at kind of these being a concern for kind of between 4 and 10 and 6 and 10 single parents. So a really significant issue moving forward. So I'm really pleased now that Andrea, one of the single parents who participated in our research, has agreed to come and talk to Laura about some of her experiences over the past year.
Thank you, Liz. Can I have Andrea on screen?
Hi, Laura.
Hi, Andrea. Hi. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk about your experience of the pandemic. And thank you also for being involved in this research. We're really great. Liz and I are really grateful. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions about your experience. So first of all, do you want to tell me about the job that you were doing before the pandemic, and a bit about your children, how old they are?
Okay, so my job is a swimming teacher. So right from the very start, I was furloughed and have been furloughed 3 times now. My children are, at the start of the pandemic, they were 5 and 6. They are now 6 and 7. So they are at school. We are now year 1 and 2. So yeah, that's how it was before the pandemic anyway.
Okay. And you were furloughed. I understand that you worked for 2 different companies before the pandemic. So how did the furlough system work for you with being employed by 2 different companies? How were you treated during the pandemic?
Okay, so the furlough scheme for me, working for 2 different companies but doing the same job, they treated it very differently. So with one company, I was paid based on last year's wages, 80% of that, and that was how it came through, as what I understood that was how the government was trying to rule it. My other job, still as a swimming teacher, they only paid 80% on my contracted hours that I actually do, as opposed to any extra hours, which I'm not contracted for, which I would have been doing last year. So they only based my 80% on my contracted hours that I was actually, still doing. So I lost out a lot there on, if I'd been going to work, I'd have been obviously earning a lot more than what I was, during furlough.
And how have you sort of coped with that? Have you dealt with that drop in income? What impact has that had on you and your children?
So it did have a massive impact on me. Before, I was just on child tax credits, and I was coping absolutely fine. In about June or July, I looked into having to go over to universal credits. Now, I'd done quite a bit of research on that, and I did find out it was a 5-week wait, and that was a hard hitting point, because I couldn't just go straight onto them. I had to try to save little by little throughout the months to be able to actually pay my bills, because the second you asked to go onto universal credits or apply for them, your child tax credits automatically stop. And that 5-week wait means that there's one set of bills that you and everything that you can't actually pay. So I had to try to save for a few months so that I could actually afford to go on to universal credits without taking an advance out and having to owe them money.
And did you have to access your children still got school meals? And I understand as well that during that early period you also accessed a food bank.
Yeah, so during that time we had the £15 a week per child, so I received £30 a week basically, and also there was a local community group that was set up by a lovely lady who got donations in from our local community, and also the food bank was heavily involved as well to help deliver food to us twice a week, lunches, activities for the children to do as well. Sometimes just even having that little chat on the doorstep, you know, at a distance when they delivered the food to us was absolutely amazing, just to talk to someone.
Yeah, that's really good to hear. And were there extra costs? Obviously there's been quite long periods when you've been at home, but also your children have been at home. Have there been extra costs to that as well?
So at first I didn't really realise it, but yeah, massive extra costs. So gas bill, electric bill, water bill, all the things, major essentials, which normally the children would be at school, I would be out the house and, you know, earning some money, and we were all in the house, so it was extra water. We had a really hot summer last year. It was filling up the paddling pool. Obviously, you don't think about these things when you're actually doing it. Also, like gas bill, heating up any hot water, doing more washing up, doing more loads of washing, and the electric bill, where the telly is pretty much on like most of the day as well. Those three things incurred extra costs. Other things that incurred extra costs was the essential things like toilet paper. I didn't realise how much toilet paper you can actually go through when you're constantly at home. And this is why I feel like when the schools or the government was doing the £15 per child per week, instead of just giving you a hamper of like 3 apples, a loaf of bread and some butter, it was really vital to me, because I could actually go and spend it on the essentials that I need, like toilet paper or cleaning stuff or washing up liquid, and things that they didn't really think to put in a hamper for parents at all. So that was a major help as well.
Thanks, Andrea. And I know that as some of the pandemic restrictions have ended, you're slowly going back to work to some degree. How is that going, and how are things different in doing your job?
So working for 2 different companies. One company, well, I've gone back to work sort of 2-3 times now, being on off. Had all of us in for training, and were absolutely fantastic. You know, this is how we have to distance the children. This is our rules. This is the regulations. This is what we need to follow. And we had a good sort of 3-hour training session on site before anyone was allowed back in the building. My other company was kind of turn up 5 minutes early before work, and we'll just tell you, you've got to stay 2 meters apart. There was no real training for it. We have managed.
And financially, have you gone back to what you were earning before the pandemic, or are there's still elements that you're not?
As of Monday just gone, when restrictions were lifted further, we've been able to go back to doing some daytime classes, and that is where a lot of my money and my earnings were lost, because the daytime classes I'm not contracted for, but now restrictions have lifted and the adults are allowed to be as a group again with the children in the water. Then I've picked up pretty much all the hours that I had back start of last year, so to speak. Financially, I still have 2 bills hanging over my head, one being a gas bill, which was kind of unexpected, but that's where I realized that how much extra you're sort of paying out when everyone's at home. And the other bill being my child tax credit bill, that I owe them money for, because I went on to universal credits, and I now owe a backdated bill to child tax credits. So I still have bills hanging over my head, but financially, working wise, I am now back earning what I was over a year ago.
That's good to hear about your work. Have you got any concerns about your work going forward? I know when we spoke earlier in the week, you've some concerns in case your children need to self-isolate if anyone gets COVID in their bubbles at school.
Yeah, so that is a big concern. I mean, I've got 2 children. One child is in year 1, the other one's in year 2. If one of those have to self-isolate, the other one's still allowed to go to school, which is completely confusing to me. But I also need to stay at home. Neither of my work has made it clear whether I would have to take unpaid leave, whether I'd have to take sick pay, whether there is still a furlough scheme that would continue that they would be able to pay me through, or how it would actually work. So it does still play on my mind, because obviously there's a lot of children at school, and it only takes that one child to have a positive test for pretty much a whole year to be off of school.
Thanks, Andrea. And finally, how are your children doing? How are they enjoying being back at school? They were with you and you home educated them. How are they getting on being back at school?
After the first lockdown, they were asking to go back at school. Mainly they wanted to see their friends. They wanted to have that contact with people their own age again. I think they got bored of mummy. However, after the next lockdown, and they went back in March, it was a different story between the 2 of them. One, yeah, she was quite happy going back to school. The other one, she was very upset about going back. She asked me if I could quit my job, and she wanted to stay at home with me, and could I homeschool her all the time.
You obviously did a very good job home educating and supporting your children. So
I tried my best. We had our moments.
Yes. Well, Andrea, thank you so much for being interviewed and talking to us today, and also for being involved in the project. Liz and I are so grateful to single parents like you and the other single parents who we interviewed, who have really shown and demonstrated what happened to you and your family during the pandemic. So I'm incredibly grateful to you. I'm now going to go back to the research and talk about the conclusions and the policy recommendations that we think are needed. So thanks very much, Andrea. So As context, before I talk about the recommendations for policy change, I'm going to talk about 3 significant issues for single parents that we think have happened as a result of the pandemic or are going to happen in the future. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 things: the growth of home and hybrid working, the availability and cost of childcare, the jobs market, and back to work support. So single parents' experience of workplace inequality, we think, will continue if home and hybrid working is seen as the only answer to workplace flexibility. And as you know from earlier in the presentation, there are some parents who hybrid and home working is really positive, but the vast majority of single parents do not do jobs that can be worked from home. So, and also for single parents looking for a job, there is a real shortage of flexible and particularly part-time working opportunities. So time-wise, in their recent flexible working index, have said even during the pandemic, the dial has barely moved in terms of the job market. So it used to be 20% of jobs were advertised with some flexibility. And despite all the changes that have happened with home working and hybrid working, they found that only 22% of jobs are advertised with some flexibility. And some flexibility might not necessarily mean part-time work. And they've talked about there being a fractured job market, with part-time jobs being the lowest paid and home working and other options for managerial jobs. And that has also been stated by the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, who've just seen that there seems to be more flexibility in geography, so in terms of home working and hybrid working, but not in relation to hours. And that's a really, going to be a really big issue for single parents. And we've got real concerns about the availability and cost of childcare. And obviously, in terms of schools, that may change. So in the short term, there's likely to be less availability of wraparound care and clubs within school settings, while in schools there's the maintenance of the separate bubbles. But we do see this as perhaps changing over the coming months. But the impact on preschool childcare is likely to be much more long-term. So already we're seeing drops in the availability of childcare. So the Quorum Childcare Survey stated that 35% of local authorities are reporting the number of childcare providers permanently closing has gone up in the last year. And the figures in London are really stark. The GLA figures really show a big drop in childcare provision, particularly in some of the more disadvantaged boroughs in London. And the government in the last week have released figures on childcare provision and have shown there already this year there have been 2,000 childcare providers who've closed. And Quorum also have found that they've seen some evidence of some increase in the cost of childcare as a result of the increased costs for childcare providers during the pandemic. And obviously, with just one income to pay for childcare, childcare costs and availability are going to be a very big issue for single parent families. So as we've already stated earlier in the talk, single parents are working in jobs that might not exist in the same way, such as hospitality, travel, and non-food retail. And there's been others who've stated the real impact on the jobs market for women in particular. So the Women and Equality Select Committee inquiry, the recent inquiry, included evidence that traditionally female-dominated work sectors have been really hit hard by the COVID pandemic, and job vacancies in the service industries remain depressed. And they call for much more emphasis for those who become unemployed to train, and this should be matched with childcare. And we're positive about some of the government's initiatives, back to work initiatives, such as the Jetson Restart programme, but these really do need to be designed with single parents in mind. So now I'm going to move on to the policy recommendations, which fall under 5 themes: improving access to childcare and reducing the upfront costs for single parents, increase opportunities for flexible working, provide clearer support for single parents whose children need to self-isolate, tailored back to work and training support for single parents, and single parent families having better access to mental health services. So in terms of childcare, as I've already stated, the childcare market has been really affected by the pandemic. And we really think that the government needs to create a childcare infrastructure support fund to help stabilise the childcare market and prevent more providers from closing. We also worry about the upfront costs for single parents who lose their job and who are trying to re-enter work, because we think the upfront costs of childcare are just prohibitive for many single parents. So we really think there needs to be a national childcare deposit fund, a bit like one which we helped develop with the GLA. And we also think that the Department of Education should review the childcare caps that were actually set in 2003, which really don't deliver the promised childcare support of up to 85% under universal credit. And that's a particular issue in the southeast of England and in London. And lastly, in terms of childcare, there was a case taken by Save the Children, which Gingerbread provided evidence for, and was won at the High Court in January. So we want the Department for Work and Pensions to act on that High Court decision to change the payment structure of universal credit so that childcare costs are made up front rather than arrears, because otherwise it's just impossible for many single parents entering work to afford that initial cost. And we really think there need to be increased opportunities for flexible working. We're hugely disappointed that the government is going to delay further the employment bill. It wasn't in the Queen's speech, and it's being delayed at a time when it's really vital that people such as single parents have opportunities in terms of how jobs are advertised flexibly. In the interim, we think that there should be the removal of the 26-week qualifying period to make a right to request application. We don't think that's the ideal answer. We think it should be at the point of job advertising. If that's not going to happen, in the meantime, we really think there should be a day one employees to make a flexible working request. We really think that the government should work with employers and employer bodies to emphasise the business case for greater flexibility in job roles. And in particular, we think there's a real place for job shares, where employers really need a role to be full-time. Dividing up a role could be really crucial for many single parents who could work at a level, at a higher level than they currently can with the current part-time jobs that are advertised. And we really urge the Flexible Working Task Force to develop a job sharing as part of the flexible working menu in adapting new ways of working after the pandemic. And as we've mentioned earlier, and Andrea talked about, there needs to be much clearer support for single parents whose children seem to need to self-isolate. we're really pleased that following our interim report, that both in England and Wales, parents can have access to the track and trace isolation grant, but we think the guidance on that is very hidden, and we think there needs to be much more publicity about it so that single parents can access that scheme. And also in terms of future school and childcare closures, we agree with the Women and Equalities Committee that emergency childcare easements are in place for single parents who are job seekers, so they're not under threat of sanctions, for instance, or work conditionality when their children are at home having to self-isolate. And in terms of back to work support, we want the government to press ahead with its long overdue review of the effectiveness of sanctions. We think there needs to be a much more supportive back to work service, which doesn't rely on sanctioning parents. And job centres should reintroduce specialist single parent advisors, and the tailored programmes that they have for back to work support really reflect the needs of single parents and their need to also care for their children. And we think there should be, for newly unemployed single parents, priority access to employment support schemes, building on the evidence of some of the voluntary schemes, those that operated in the past, such as the New Deal for lone parents, but also schemes that are being developed, for instance, in Scotland under their devolved powers, which are much more supportive and longer term. And in terms of skills, we think there's a real vital role for helping skills training for single parents and matching that with access to free childcare. And as we've said, and Liz talked about the impact on the mental health of single parents who've been really disproportionately affected by isolation. We urge the government and service providers to ensure that single parents and their children have priority access to mental health services. So in conclusion, single parent families have been hit hard, a bit harder than other family types throughout the pandemic. It has made worse pre-pandemic inequalities. It's important that single parents are not left behind as the government builds back better. Thank you. And now I'm going to hand back to Tony Wilson, who is going to chair the question and answer section of the
Brilliant.
Thank you, Tony.
Well, look, thanks so much, Laura, Liz, and to Andrea for that run through the presentations, and particularly to Andrea for telling us about her experiences during the crisis. And I hope Andrea will be able to stay on for some of the Q&A as well, as I know we've had a question specifically for her too. And I think we'll all probably want to reflect a bit on some of her experiences, which are very much reflected in the broader findings from the research and some of the broader data as well about the impacts. Hi Andrea, thanks for coming back on, and thanks to Victoria for her for introducing us and starting us off. We do have some questions in the Q&A box now, which is great. Just like a broken record, it's at the bottom there, so do feel free to add questions too. We're going to start with a couple that were submitted in advance of the event. And the first was around employer practices, and it was whether we had any insights or examples of what employers have been doing to support single parents during the crisis, sort of good and bad, and what we might learn from that. Andrea, we sort of heard from you in particular about your experiences, and for me that encapsulated a lot of what we've heard in our employer-facing research more broadly about the crisis. It's a really mixed bag. I mean, some firms, particularly often larger firms in sectors often that have better union representation, like retail, for example, have really gone to great lengths to give people the ability to not work in face-to-face roles or work with protection and so on. And others have largely said, you're coming back on Monday, we'll see you then. It's been really hard. I think a lot of firms have got better at dealing with that, but my worry is that now, as restrictions are starting to ease, we might see more of that again. I see you've unmuted, Andrew. I don't know if you wanted to add anything about your experiences of kind of employer support, and then I'll ask Laura to come in, Laura or Liz to come in too.
Yep. So my employer support from both the companies I work with, I think during the pandemic there was, and I think it's this week or last week, was the whole mental health awareness week. That via both companies was very felt upon. I received so many emails with contact numbers that I could do ring at any time 24/7 if I felt like, you know, I needed someone to talk to. All the employees from both companies obviously received the same email, and you could literally pick up the phone, and it was a outer company that you know, you could just ring just for support, someone to talk to, which was really, really great. One of my companies also, when I'd gone on to universal credits and had to be earning a certain amount, and I wasn't sure, being on furlough, what my amounts were, one of my companies, my line manager and my main manager in the building both said that they would write me a report for my universal credit journal to state that in actual fact I normally do earn what the bracket should be without being sanctioned, but being on furlough it was different, and when I returned to work my earnings would go back up. So both companies have been very supportive. One, there was a lot more communication with text messages, WhatsApp groups set up so that we could stay in contact with everyone, so you didn't just feel alone at all, and you felt like you could pick up the phone really easily and just talk to someone. So that was great from both companies. Yeah,
really good to hear. Thanks Andrea. Laura, what is?
Well, I think Liz touched on this in part of her talk, that it really was those employers that respected and provided autonomy to single parents who were working from home, in how they did their hours, and much more kind of output focused. Some employers went beyond. They gave extra leave to some single parents during the third lockdown, because they recognised that they were homeschooling. But it really did vary with employers, and single parents could still feel under enormous pressure to deliver both for their children and for their employer, and that brought up tensions. And as Liz has mentioned, and what is slightly worrying going forwards, is during a lockdown everyone's in it together, so to speak, and people are aware of it. When children are going to be sent home to self-isolate, it's very different, and it can be really, I mean, some parents that we interviewed, their children were sent home from school, they missed a third of the autumn term. Well, that's very different with, you know, for employers, when some employers their children don't need to self-isolate at all. And going forward, I think that will be an issue, and employers tend to not to have been as so flexible in that respect. So Liz, did you want to add anything? Okay.
Okay, great. I wonder if we might take one of these questions here from the live Q&A. So I need to select it and click answer live. So I thought we might take Samantha Thorne's question. So she's asked about what the research might have revealed about the squeezed middle of single parent professionals who might be just outside the support of the benefit system, but not enough to be able to get the services and the convenience they might need to meet the extra needs from in particular from supporting kids when schools were closed, and whether this came up at all in our research, whether there's any sort of any things in particular we should be focusing on here. I think that's for Laura and Liz.
Yeah, so certainly we certainly interviewed some single parents who weren't in receipt of benefits, but did feel that the extra financial requirements sort of demanded them from the pandemic meant that actually they felt they probably should have been eligible. So this was often those with kind of older children who weren't eligible for free school meals, then found that when they had them at home for kind of long periods, actually you know, it did cost quite a lot. And because their earnings were only marginally above what would have got them on benefits, they felt that they'd kind of moved into the territory where they would require benefits normally, but it just wasn't accounted for because of kind of the very unexpected nature of the pandemic. So certainly there was a handful of single parents who spoke about that, and sometimes were kind of quite resentful that they weren't sort of eligible for any support of that sort.
Great, thank you. And we'll stay on these on the questions here on the chat, if that's okay. Ed Hodgson had a question for Andrew about the universal credit advance payment, and whether perhaps worries about getting into debt might have been one of the reasons for not taking advantage of that, and whether and also then a follow-up question about whether there've been any opportunities to get in contact with advice services, for example, citizens advice.
So I looked into doing the advance system, and I mean, it works out that you still have to pay it back in the end. So it's then from your then payments that Universal Credit will give you, you then get less because they automatically take it back each month. So I felt my best way through it would be to try to save up in advance. So then for those months that when I was getting Universal Credit, it wasn't being taken away from me. And also the other fact is where you have to really look into going onto Universal Credit is to see if you qualify, because once you apply, all other benefits then stop completely. And that was another major concern of making sure that, you know, I would be 100% eligible for it before I actually, you know, applied for it. So yeah, I didn't want to go down the advance route. I felt I don't particularly like owing people money if I can help it. So if I can get paid, you know, get a little bit upfront to be able to cope myself, then I will. So yeah.
And I think this crisis has really shown up some of those problems with universal credit, and in particular that 5-week assessment period and the impact.
It was horrendous. Yeah. And like I say, child tax credit are still on to me to owe them back £240 because they had paid me in advance. But I don't know. I don't.
Well, I think
I've got to get on to them about, I guess.
Yeah. No, and there's a comment here from Umar Ansari as well, saying about the nature of so many single parents. We don't like to owe money to anyone, and this is, I mean, I think this is a reality for many people in sort of, you know, in low incomes who are supporting families. I mean, it's incredibly stressful to get into debt, or potentially into debt. I mean, the universal credit point, I mean, just to add to it, I think the particular issue here has been obviously that significant changes of circumstances force people off the old benefits and into universal credit, and this crisis has led to hundreds of thousands of these significant changes. So that massive growth in universal credit claims that we've seen a lot in their data isn't just being driven by kind of real economy effects, it's being driven by people being moved from one benefit to another and then encountering debt. And actually this ties in with one of the questions we had in advance was about housing and any understanding about impacts of housing, in particular risks of homelessness, is that transition, particularly for people in rented housing, and we know that single parents are twice as likely to be in rented housing, leads to housing debt. You know, social landlords in particular say over and over again that they're racking up tens of millions, probably eventually it'll be hundreds of millions of pounds of social housing debt as people move from legacy benefits to universal credit. And right now that's not an issue because well, it's obviously an issue, but it's not leading to eviction action because there's a moratorium on that until the 31st of May. But that's only 2 weeks away, and it doesn't feel at all like we're through the crisis. So those worries, actually we've seen homelessness numbers coming down during the crisis because of a massive, you know, effort to reduce homelessness, but also eviction protection. And it feels like this is potentially quite a significant problem we could be storing up, you know, particularly for people in private rented accommodation and social rented accommodation, and particularly for people who've been forced off legacy benefits and been made to claim universal credit. mean, Laura and Liz, I don't know if you wanted to add anything more about this. I mean, you've talked a lot in the research about and in the presentation about, you know, family finance and try and budget on low incomes and deal with the, you know, the stress that the crisis has caused and disruption and increased costs for many parents as well. I'm not sure if you wanted to add anything on those points.
Yes, I mean, we covered in the analysis from your organisation, we covered about housing sort of tenure, and as you've included the figures on single parents being much more likely to be in rented accommodation. So we have that context, but we didn't particularly focus on housing and housing costs within this project, apart from the context of housing. Liz, did you want to add anything?
No, just to say, I mean, we did ask single parents more broadly about the ways in which the crisis had impacted upon them. And housing, well, it wasn't really an issue that emerged, but I think that's probably for some of the reasons Tony just outlined.
Yeah.
It probably wasn't an immediate concern, but actually down the road, there are issues that are going to become problematic quite soon.
The further question we had in advance was about any assessment of the impacts of the crisis on ethnic minority groups, on ethnic minority parents. So I said that I would address this in part first before handing over to Liz for some of the qualitative insights. In that quantitatively we can't. It's very hard in the data to look. The sample sizes aren't big enough to look by ethnicity and by whether you're a single parent or not. But we do know from research that we've been doing about different impacts on ethnic minority groups more broadly in the labour market. And sort of unsurprisingly, you see similar things around kind of occupational and sectoral effects. So you know that a lot of this reflects where people may be overrepresented in some occupations or in some industries. And a couple of things that really stand out, and some of this does overlap with the findings we presented on single parents on the quantitative analysis of single parents in the report. But some of the things that do stand out is, for example, that Black people are twice as likely to work in caring roles as other ethnic groups, and much more likely to be in particularly in sort of social care and healthcare. And one of the things that we saw, and indeed in childcare, one of the things that we saw in the first lockdown in particular was a really significant fall in numbers of people employed in caring jobs, as a lot of, you know, caring, as we already said, many of us experienced, and maybe all of us would have experienced, you know, a lot of childcare facilities were shut down, and after school clubs were closed and so on. So we did see disproportionate impacts in particular there. Black people have seen quite significant effects on employment. The most recent data published yesterday showed potentially some improvement in that, but did see really significant impacts. And we know as well that Pakistani and Bangladeshi people are much more likely to work in sales and customer service roles, but also in hotels and restaurants. And again, two areas really significantly affected by the lockdown. By lockdowns, slightly less affected, single parents slightly less affected, or affected in similar proportions to the wider population in those areas. But so I think if we had data, I think we would sort of see some of those occupational effects in particular. And it's important to say as well, some of that job growth has been in professional jobs in the last 6 months, and that may well have disadvantaged, I think, some people from lower income backgrounds, lower qualified people in particular, thinking about the growth in like test and trace related jobs, for example, pandemic jobs, and probably some minority groups. But Liz, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add from the qualitative findings as well.
Yeah, so just to say, for the qualitative interviews, we did ensure that our sample covered diversity in terms of ethnicity. While not much came through that was kind of specific to BAME groups in particular, there was evidence of a greater sort of concern about actually getting COVID and the health impacts of it, due to the fact these groups do have a higher risk. And this could impact on a whole range of different things, from including kind of using grandparents again for childcare once that became allowed, to sort of levels of concern about children returning to school, to sort of single parents' own level of worry about going back and working in a workplace. So I think that was the main impact we saw going forward. But I know Gingerbread has a wider interest in this issue moving forward as well.
Great, brilliant, thank you. So we've got one more question, and I don't want to keep people from their lunch as well. So we certainly won't keep going till 1 o'clock if we're out of questions. But you do have time if you'd like to add any more questions, and please do. We'll pick up this one question, which I might need to have a go at first before I hand over to others. It's about Restart. Oh, thank you, Nikki. Got another one now. So question from Liz Saul. Hi, Liz. So Liz has asked about the Restart contracts going to large generalist providers and what they need to do in order to ensure their offers are their services are appropriate for single parents. Now, this is an area that I've got a quite close interest in. We've been doing quite a lot of work in looking at the Restart programme and generally around sort of what works in improving support for specific groups in the labour market. I think Restart is potentially a really great opportunity compared with the work programme which it was replacing. And this is because it's a bit better funded than the work programme. The work programme was funded about half as well as Restart. And it's also got much clearer service standards, requirements around the frequency of contact and the nature of contact that people should get. So I think that's going to be positive. That's going to be more positive than we've had in the past. However, I think, as we said in the report, recommendation number 4 in the report, and we said really clearly that we think there's a really strong case for specialist employment support for single parents who are out of work. And actually, I think this isn't just about supporting single parents who are out of work. It's also about supporting single parents who are in work and who want help to progress. We found in the quantitative analysis in the interim report, the single parents were 1.5 times more likely to be underemployed, to want more hours, and than couple parents and people without children. And specialist support means having, learning from things like the old New Deal for lone parents. It means having an advisor who kind of understands what it's like to be a single parent and support that may be needed, who can help to join up with other services, who can help with getting the skill support that you might need, can help with wider sort of social support and engagement, and can work with employers around job design, around flexible working, and around kind of getting the right fit for the individual. So I think we think that's essential. We've seen a move away in Job Centre Plus from specialist work coaches towards a more generalist role, but I do think Restart does offer us a really good opportunity to move back into specialist support. We did have specific recommendations in there too about skills and childcare, so I might ask if Laura might want to add a bit about that, and also any reflections on employment support more broadly for single parents.
Yes, so the Restart programme for people who are at this event who don't know is for claimants who've been unemployed for a year and above. And I agree with Tony. I think it could be a real opportunity, and there's some real positives about it. But what happens with the contracts is that they go to major providers. I think there have been 12 large providers who've got the government contracts, and then they tend to subcontract and can subcontract to some specialist providers. But I think the concern with that it becomes quite a postcode lottery. So if there might not be provision for single parents from some of those larger providers might not subcontract. And thanks, Liz, for your question. I've had the pleasure of actually attending the GROW programme which you run, and I've seen that specialist provision in practice, and I've seen some of the excellent work that organisations like yours do in London. And I think it would be absolutely brilliant if those larger contractors would really think of specialist provision for parents in London and nationally, and really tap into some of the excellent work that providers like you provide, and also as Tony has said, that there's that specialist provision within job centres. I think it's a really big task for a work coach to deal with the broad spectrum of the different claimants that they see. I think it's really tough on them. And there is a bit of a growth of specialist provision, particularly those claimants who have a disability, or for younger claimants. And I think there's a real place for that specialism, as they've doubled the amount of work coaches during the pandemic because of the rise of universal credit claimants. And I really think that single parents should have that specialist support. And yes, in terms of training, I think it was interesting. One of the the parents that Liz and I interviewed was, there was a job that came up that there was, training that was required before that person could start a job, and it was full time. So it's also about how training is designed. And I agree with the Women and Equality Select Committee that, training should just be much more of a major, and retraining into industries that are going to arise post-pandemic. It really does need to be designed with different people in mind, including single parents, and offering childcare that complements it. I noticed that some of the DWP and the government are listening to some extent. I see that actually work coaches can offer up to 12 weeks of training, whereas it used to be 10 weeks. But they need to publicise that. They need to have it, show it as the full menu when someone is in front of them, to tell them, because people, they don't publicise it. So how are people to know, and how are people to know that they will be supported to do that?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Laura. Got a very quick question from Ed Hodson, and then we'll probably wrap up, unless we have any more, with a question for all of the panel from Nikki Pound, where Nikki's asking, so we'll give it a moment to think about this, that given this withdrawal of support measures, increasing withdrawal of support measures, from now, really, from June time onwards, what are the kind of immediate priorities for extending or improving or clarifying support for single parents? So we've got quite a lot of ideas in the report, so we'll wrap up with that, and we'll go around everyone on the panel on that in just a moment. But first, Ed had a quick question, which I think there may be a quick answer for, which was whether we had any insights around urban and rural differences in experiences from the qualitative research. Liz.
Yes. So again, we sampled to ensure diversity on that. In terms of what actually came up, I think the main thing I'm aware of was around availability of childcare, with kind of closure of childcare provision having a much bigger impact if someone is rural to start with. So that might increase, the distance they have to drive to get their child from childcare. I think in one instance, I remember it decreased from 3 miles to something like 30 miles, which just then became unviable in terms of commuting to their work as well. So I imagine, the impacts for rural single parents will be more about, provision of services where these are declining, so such as childcare, for example, really. And possibly, I guess, around jobs, jobs going forward in terms of where the jobs are, how far they have to commute, and that sort of thing.
Great. Thanks, Liz. So good. Well, look, thanks everybody for your questions and comments. We have one final one from Nikki, which is a nice way to round off with the panel giving their views on what we can do to clarify, improve, or extend support for single parents. So I might ask Laura, then Liz, then Andrea, and then we give the final word to Victoria to say about what more broadly around what Gingerbread will be prioritising in the coming months. Laura.
I think a priority's got to be that single parent unemployment, short-term unemployment, doesn't become long-term unemployment. So measures to try and help that from happening. I would love it if there was more specialist support for single parents as a priority, and that the Restart programme that will, which is about to begin, really focuses on that specialist support, and that providers of the Restart programme are assessed on that. But I think really urgently there needs to be support for the childcare sector, because without that, so real kind of a real emphasis on that is needed really quickly. And as I said in my talk, so disappointed about the employment bill not progressing during this Parliament. And so the government might have to think of things more immediately that it does. I'd love a priority. They have a find a job service, the DWP has that. Could they not, advertise job shares? Could they not prioritise incentivising employers to do job shares before the bill happens, as a real practical way of opening up more quality part-time work? So those would be my 3 priorities in the short term.
Thank you. And I think your point on the employment bill, sorry, I meant to mention this earlier, I mean, is really well made. When you think about what's now not going to be taken forward, that's enhanced protection for women who are pregnant or on maternity leave. That's enhanced protection for unpaid carers. That's the consultation on the right to request on the right to default flexibility by default in work. And its protections around getting security of hours, guaranteed hours, where people have contracts that are flexible hours but routinely work similar hours. I mean, this is almost like it's sort of laser targeted at the sorts of issues that single parents have to deal with day in, day out in the workplace. But I think all of us should continue to be advocating for that, and it doesn't require legislation to fix that. It requires employers to up their game. Many do. Many were calling for the employment bill for that reason. So let's keep pressing on employers to do the right thing and see the benefits of being more of offering greater flexibility and security. Liz.
Yeah, so just shifting to another topic, I think self-isolation isn't going away anytime soon. And I just think, from the research, the qualitative interviews I was involved in, it was kind of quite shocking how even by, towards the end of the third lockdown, actually employers didn't seem to have policies on it. Single parents were sort of being asked to do conflicting things. There was no sort of guidance on what they should prioritise. There was a lack of awareness of the financial support. And in individual circumstances, it could lead to kind of really problematic kind of couple of weeks where either families had to take a big hit financially or, essentially in some instances kind of break the rules and, we had to, take their children out with them to work with that sort of thing. So I just think it needs, going forward, it needs to be much more joined up and much more clearly disseminated to single parents, are aware of what they can access, what they're allowed to do, what their employers will be able to do for them as well.
Great, thank you, Liz. Andrea.
Hi there, sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. And so during the first pandemic, I've got to say, my company was good with keeping in contact. I will also say that the school that my children go to, every other week, we had 2 teachers come round to the house to check that we were all okay.
Wow.
So they were coming round with paperwork as well of schoolwork, delivering, making sure they saw the kids, asked how we were, whether we were still in our pajamas or we were, wide awake at midday and having lunch. But I felt that the school in our area and the local community as well really pulled together. And I, as a single parent, it was overwhelming, to be honest, the support we had. There was some community groups that were set up as well, where they delivered lunch to the house and from the food bank twice a week as well. And again, a nice doorstep chat, so you didn't feel alone. So that was really nice, because a lot of the first lockdown, there was no bubbles. So it was literally just me, my 2 children, and that was it. So even to have that distance chat at the end of a driveway was, or someone knock on the door to say, how are you? How are the children? And the children seeing a friendly face, being a teacher, they could say, oh, look, it's my teacher. So that was really, really nice. So I felt that in my area, we had the support of the schools and the community. Yeah.
Brilliant. It's really good to hear. Thanks, Andrea. Victoria, and the last word to you.
Thank you, Tony. Firstly, I'd like to thank you, Tony, for chairing this event. And I'd also like to thank Liz, Laura and Andrea. I'd reiterate much of what Laura has said. The most important thing that the government needs to do is to enact policy change to enable and facilitate single parents to return to work. Single parents' needs are very particular. They're juggling caring responsibilities and a job, and they need flexibility and they need understanding. And it's really important that the government and employers look after single parents and enable them to work. I'd also say that this report has shown that the mental health and well-being of single parents has been severely impacted by the pandemic. And it's something that we will be looking at Gingerbread, but it's also important, I think, for employers to remember that for the single parents in their workforce, they're juggling often alone childcare and their job, it's really important to look after their employees' well-being and to ensure that they are coping and they are managing. I'd also say that we don't write these reports because we like writing reports. We write these reports because we want to effect change. And so it's really important for the government to consider the needs of single parents and to enact legislation and real policy change that will enable and facilitate single parents to return to work. Otherwise, I think the very real risk is that single parents are going to get left behind. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks. Look, just to add my thanks to all of the panelists. Thank you so much for joining us today, especially to Andrea for agreeing to, in effect, a third interview in the Caring Without Sharing project, and this time doing one that's recorded.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for listening to me.
Yeah, no, thank you. No, it's really great and it's really fantastic. Thank you so much for telling us, for talking so openly about your experiences. Yeah, it's been really good to hear about the good sides as well as some of the some of the real challenges that I think we've all experienced and single parents have experienced in particular during the crisis. I mean, the only point I'd say by way of sort of conclusion, I think when we look at things like the labour market data that came out yesterday, and we see unemployment coming down, and we're on a roadmap out of lockdown, it kind of feels like it's light at the end of a tunnel and things are getting better. I think reports like the work that Laura and Liz have put in, and colleagues at IES have put in over the last year, really show how this this crisis isn't going away and it's not job done, and that there and that this will have lasting effects on people, and also that we have to learn from the things that went wrong, but also the things that went well in the last year. And it's always seemed the case, I think this research shows it, that single parents have been significantly and uniquely hit by this crisis, and that means that we do need to really think about how we can respond in a way that's much more appreciative of those effects and much more supportive of single parents as a group, so and individually. So thank you so much for everyone who's joined us. Thanks, colleagues, for speaking today, and thanks to Standard Life Foundation for funding this work, and I'd highly commend the work that they're doing and the work that they're funding at the moment. There's some really fantastic things that are coming out, really shining a light on the impacts of this crisis. So thank you everybody for joining us. This will be, I'm sure that all of us are very happy to be contacted. If you do get in touch, you'll find us on social media or by Googling. The link to the recording will be available after the event if anyone wants to watch it back or you want to share it with others. Thanks everyone again. Hope you have a good lunch and a good day, and I hope to see you all again at a future event in future. Thanks very much. Bye now.